So thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Tracy. I work with Linda at the Asbestos Disease Awareness Organization. I'm so grateful to everyone for taking time out of their day to join us today. We're very excited to have these amazing experts here to talk with us about talc and asbestos and what you need to know. Linda will be our fearless interviewer and moderator, and I will be here if you have any technical difficulties during the chat. You can always privately chat me if there's something going on, or if you have a problem or need more information about something after the call. If you have a question that you'd like to ask our experts during the call, you can either type it into the Zoom chat box, or you can share that question privately with Nikki Neal, who is acting as our question fairy. And Nikki is going to be then sorting out the questions from the rest of anything for Linda to take during this call. We want to remind you that this should be considered a public forum, so you shouldn't share any sensitive personal or private medical information that you wouldn't want to share publicly. And we're also asking that for the duration of this meeting that you mute your lines and keep your videos off so that we can keep the focus on our speakers. And I'll be muting my line and turning my video off now as I'm turning it over to Linda. So Linda, thank you so much for gathering all these amazing people together, and take it away.
Thank you, Tracy. Okay, so this is our third Zoom event. We always kind of say we're alone together. And the third one I think is going to be really spectacular in the way of our speakers' knowledge, but also relevant content. Before we begin today, just for a little things for you folks to know, of course, Tracy went through how to ask a question, which will all be answered at the end of this Zoom. I got some emails about people who actually didn't know who ADAO was, and that's why they were joining. So very briefly, ADAO is the largest nonprofit dedicated to preventing all asbestos-caused diseases, which means obviously not just mesothelioma, but asbestos-caused lung cancer, ovarian, and Dr. Moline is going to go into the other diseases. And we work on education, advocacy, and community support. We have found a great need over the last 16 years that ADAO has been doing our nonprofit work, that there's a need in the community, but also within Congress for education and elsewhere to collectively unite and bring our knowledge together. Before we start, I really want to thank Dr. Moline and Bob Sussman. They're two busy individuals, experts in high demand, and they're going to give us an hour of their time today. ADAO's leadership allows ADAO to flourish, and Jackie serves on our science advisory board with others, but we're in a really fortunate place with ADAO is that we have experts all over the United States that believe in our work and support us so we can always get it right. And then also our sponsors. ADAO requires a small amount of money, but we are so grateful that we have the Simmons Law Firm that as a platinum sponsor. Again, I know Perry Browder's on this call. And our gold sponsors are Motley Rice and the American Federation of Teachers, two groups that make a very, very big difference. So I want to thank all of our sponsors, Simmons, Hanley, Conroy, Motley Rice, and the American Federation Teacher, and of course our silver and bronze sponsors. But if you want any more information about their work, although we don't make legal referrals, you can certainly find their websites on our donation page. So that's a little bit about the housekeeping. We're going to keep this flowing so that you can ask questions because these experts want to answer your questions. At the end, Nicole and I are going to send you a thank you email with hopefully some links that will help you get hold on to some of the key points that are going to be brought up. And also, you'll probably want to join our May 28th event, also with Dr. Moline and Bob Sussman and 10 other experts like from the International Association of Firefighters, American Public Health Association. We are going to be doing our own press conference about the dangerously flawed EPA draft risk evaluation. And we have experts all over the nation working with us. They'll have their own voice, but they'll also will be resonating, I think, the same aspects of the problems with the draft risk evaluation. So are you, Bob and Jackie, are you guys ready to begin?
Sure.
Cool. So Dr. Moline, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, because your credentials are really fabulous. So share a little bit, and it's your chance to crow.
Yeah, I don't like really crowing, but I'll just give you a little brief background. So I trained in internal medicine, graduated from the University of Chicago in college and medical school, and did my internal medicine residency program at Yale, and then went to Mount Sinai School of Medicine to do my occupational medicine training. Significant because that's where Irving Selikoff came from, and he really established um, asbestos as one of the major public health problems in the United States. And actually, I think our first Zoom speaker, Arthur Frank, Dr. Frank trained with him and actually was the first PhD recipient at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, and certainly the only one from the department where Dr. Selikoff was. And I spent a number of years on the faculty at Mount Sinai, where my practice was increasingly devoted to treating asbestos exposed individuals, primarily in the construction trades, but also family members of people who are exposed. And then in 2010, I left Mount Sinai and founded the Department of what's now called Occupational Medicine, Epidemiology, and Prevention at Northwell Health, which is a large medical health system in the Northeast. And we have a medical school associated with Hofstra, which is the Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra and Northwell, which is a 50-50 partnership between Hofstra University and Northwell Health. So I've continued to see asbestos exposed individuals, and my interests have been in all forms of asbestos exposure and in all venues of asbestos exposure over the past almost 30 years that I've been doing this. One area that I also got involved with in 2001 was to help develop the medical surveillance and ultimately treatment programs post 9/11, where we know asbestos was a large part of the construction of the buildings, the renovations, and I am still proud to be directing one of the clinical centers of excellence that's run by my institution at Northwell Health. But today we're going to be talking about Talc for my part of it, and ready to answer your questions.
Great. And Dr. Moline, you and I actually met at our very first asbestos awareness conference in New York that was held at Mount Sinai.
I remember that, and I had the pleasure of meeting your husband then.
You did, so we go pretty far back. We're going to keep this as an informal chat, but as a physician, what I would really love for you to explain to this audience is how asbestos is dangerous. Talk a little bit about the chemical components to asbestos inhalation.
So asbestos is dangerous. You know, we're hearing a lot in the news about this invisible enemy right now, which is COVID-19. Well, asbestos is another form of invisible enemy, because it is microscopic, and it can be macroscopic, meaning you can see it with the naked eye when it's in a large enough quantity, but it exists in a fiber form in a microscopic or invisible form to the naked eye. Asbestos is dangerous because it causes a number of health effects. They range from the most serious, which are cancers like mesothelioma, lung cancer, but it's also associated with two other cancers, laryngeal cancer, which is cancer of the throat, and ovarian cancer. And there's likely an association with colorectal cancer as well, possibly with some gastric cancers. It also causes what are called non-malignant or non-cancerous diseases. And those include scarring of the lung. And that when it's caused by asbestos, it's called asbestosis. And that can impair the individual's who's affected ability to breathe and get oxygen in, and leads to shortness of breath, and can ultimately be fatal in severe cases. It can cause something called pleural plaques, or scarring of the lining of the lung, which is known as the pleura. There can be a buildup of fluid around the lung, which is called a pleural effusion, and it can be found as a result of asbestos exposure, and it's not malignant in that case. Sometimes people who develop asbestos-related cancers or other types of cancers develop a pleural effusion, and that's associated with the cancer, but you can get asbestos-related pleural effusions that are non-malignant. And so those are the various types of diseases that are associated with asbestos. So it ranges from scarring of the lining of the lung, where most people have it and they don't have a lot of symptoms, to fatal diseases like certain cancers.
No, that's excellent. I loved how you explained it. So let's touch on the 4 groups. So when I testify in Congress, you have 5 minutes. You were recently an excellent witness at a December 2019 hearing, and I'll make sure that people have your testimony after this chat. But we describe not only the workers who are exposed to asbestos, but also the para-occupational, those wives that may have washed the clothing. We also talk about, my testimony, deadly hugs, because children have hugged a parent who has worked with it. But I think what really is important now is there is an element of also consumer exposure. And that's what we've been hearing a lot about Johnson & Johnson and some of the other identifiable products that the media will pick up. But would you touch on how the latency impacts these 4 groups? We think about occupational, para-occupational, the children of those families, and of course, consumer exposure?
Sure. So the one that's been most well described is occupational, and that means someone who worked with the product or worked adjacent to the product. And sometimes you'll also hear the term called bystander exposure, and that means somebody who's not working directly with the product, but is in the room or in the environment where the product is being used and has the same risk or slightly less risk. In some cases, sometimes it's the same amount of risk. So then the next group you talked about is household exposure. And we can use the term para-occupational, but I think household makes a little more sense, because then you think about where you're getting the exposure from. So you can get it from your workplace, you can get it from the home. If someone works with asbestos-containing products in the home or brings them into the home, let's say they worked as a pipe fitter or an insulator, or someone who was an auto mechanic and they wore their dusty clothes home, they took them and the person doing the laundry shook out the clothes, then that would contaminate the home. And that would also contaminate the air of the person who's shaking it out. And there have been studies that have actually measured the amount of asbestos in the air during that active shakeout, and it can be as high as somebody gets from an occupational exposure. Another place people have exposure in their home is from home renovations that might have been done, where, and this goes into the latency. Latency is the time from when someone is exposed to when they develop disease. So we've all been, I like to bring things back to what we're all focused on right now, unfortunately, which is COVID-19. So the latency is also called incubation when you're talking about an infectious disease. So we know the COVID latency is about up to 14 days, which is why we have these 14-day quarantines. The latency with asbestos is, in general, a minimum of about 10, 11 years, but it can go 60, 70, 80 years out afterwards. So when someone's exposed to when someone develops a disease can be decades later. Why is that important? Someone may have been exposed when they were 5 or 6 to the fact that there was construction in their home from asbestos products. They were crawling around on the ground. They were playing with the dust that was there, and they won't remember it, or they won't be aware of it, and yet they've had that exposure when they were younger. So there can be exposure from work that's being done in the home with a number of products that contained asbestos before they were taken off the market, and also from consumer products, which is another topic for today, where asbestos was widely used, or talc was widely used in a whole panoply of different consumer products. And those range from, if we take a talc, not just the talcum powders that have been in the news when we think about the cosmetic talc, but when there are dozens of industrial talc uses, so that a can of paint may have talc in it. So while the paint is there and it's already being, when it's in liquid form, it's not going to be a hazard because you can't breathe in the liquid. The people making the paint may be at risk if they're mixing up the various dry components with the liquid, then they have potential for exposure. And it's in a variety of other products that I think we'll talk about. So those are really the different areas. So you can get it from work, you can get it from the house, you can get it from, there is some environmental exposure. If you lived in a community where there was a mine, those are pretty discrete areas that we're well aware of in the United States and actually throughout the world. And we know from consumer products.
Oh, that's excellent. So when my late husband was going through the pleural effusion and background checks, one of the physicians asked Alan, were you ever exposed to asbestos? And in 2002, for us, we really didn't know much about it. And Alan wore a suit and tie to work. And he said, no, never. Had a physician been educated like you, Dr. Moline, and said, did you ever work in a shipyard? Did you do home repairs? The conversation would have been different, and Alan's diagnosis would have happened earlier. I'm not sure it would have changed the outcome, but I think the patient and physician knowledge together connecting, and I know Mavis is on the call, that for some doctors, there's a disconnect between exposure. So this is a really important element for all of us to know. Let's talk about your recent published study that you did. The title is Mesothelioma Associated with the Use of Cosmetic Talc. It's excellent.
Sure. So just to give a little historical reference, in 1960, a doctor in South Africa published the first paper on mesothelioma associated with asbestos exposure, and he described 33 individuals who were exposed to asbestos from the workplace, from the mines, from people who are exposed to the asbestos as in the community, and from household exposure. And that's really where everyone says, okay, yes, mesothelioma is associated with asbestos exposure. So I began seeing a number of individuals, and I was referred in a number of cases of individuals who had asbestos exposure, and the commonality was cosmetic talc. And that led to me beginning to look into why cosmetic talcum powder would lead to mesothelioma, and the fact that there was asbestos in the cosmetic talcum powder, which was causing the mesothelioma. So I wrote a paper. It was the first paper that was published that really had a large case series, and it's a case series in the medical literature is when you describe a number of different individuals who have the same disease, and you try to understand how there might be an association or what is common between all of them that can lead to further research. What we found in these individuals is these 33 did not have any other known source of asbestos exposure that we could discern from the information that we were provided. So the age range was, I think, from about 27 to 88 years. And it was primarily female, which is representative of who uses cosmetic talcum powder. There were some men included in the study who use cosmetic talcum powder. Also, men have exposure to cosmetic talcum powder, particularly if they go to a barber a lot, and cosmetic talc is used to brush off their neck. And there were actually some hairdressers in the 33 patients or 33 individuals that we described. So it was really one of the first opportunities for people to think about, let's broaden those questions, just how Alan wasn't asked more broadly about how he could have been exposed to asbestos, apart from the very well-known sources of asbestos exposure, boilers, shipyards, construction materials. No one asked any of these folks. Their treating doctors didn't know that asbestos contaminated cosmetic talc. So none of them were asked if they used cosmetic talc. And for many of these people, they had used talcum powders for decades, and they'd used it in ways that they used it multiple times a day. In some cases, they used it on their sheets, and particularly those folks who are in the South, to try to freshen the sheets and make it cooler when they got into bed at night, so they had continued exposure. They used it to take the sand off their legs and the legs of their children at the beach. They used it as a dry shampoo. There were so many different ways that people used talcum powder. People who were wearing, divers who were trying to get into wetsuits, commercial divers, putting talcum powder in there. So no one was asking because no one knew that there was a connection. So that was really the whole point of our paper, which was to say mesothelioma can occur in individuals whose sole exposure is to cosmetic talc. But as importantly, when you go to the doctor with any medical problem you might have, is to really think about different exposures that can affect your health. Since my paper came out, there's been another paper of another 75 folks who had mesothelioma associated with cosmetic talc. So now there's well over 100 individuals published in the medical literature who have mesothelioma, which is the characteristic cancer from asbestos associated with the use of cosmetic talc.
So I'll make sure I put links to both of those studies in our thank you email, so those participants from today can read your studies, because they are excellent. So here's the tough question that Bob and I and others struggle with. So without a ban and out-of-date testing methods, we know Americans remain at risk. There's another problem, a long history, where industry hires junk scientists to write papers and get them published. So it diminishes the risk and increases doubt. So we live in this world where some people truly don't believe that asbestos has a risk. Maybe that's convenient or naive, but we're still fighting the old thought that asbestos has been banned. So what I find over the last 16 years, people just can't identify. They can't normally see fibers on their own unless it's a huge rock and bundled, but they want to know where it could be. Your cosmetic work is really fascinating, but you really educated us recently on a strategic call, and Bob and I were both talking about it. Your source of consumer products, which would be handled by the EPA, and of course cosmetics, the FDA has jurisdictions over that. Your list of consumer products that could contain talc, asbestos contaminated talc, was huge. Could you touch on possibly the top 5 or most common? And I don't want to make your list too short, but we could put a link to products that could commonly contain asbestos and asbestos contaminated talc. Could you touch on the top 5 that you might see in your space?
Sure. So actually the United States Geological Survey in 2018 actually looked at where industrial talc, or actually where talc was part of consumer products. And the top number, 22%, was used in ceramics. And ceramics isn't just pottery, but think about your sink, or your toilet bowl. Those are also, it's used in the manufacturing. If it's not in the mold, is used as a filler. It's used in paints. It's used in paper as a filler. It's used in plastics. It's used in rubber. It's used to prevent sticking in the rubber industry, was used in the tire manufacturing to keep to allow the tires to come out of the molds, and also when they were stacked so that they wouldn't stick next to each other. It's also used in roofing materials. And then, so ceramics was about 22%. Cosmetic talc was only about 2%, or cosmetics in general was only about 2%. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude of talcum powder that's being used. The majority that's used in the United States is actually industrial talc rather than cosmetic.
No, that's really important. And I attended a recent meeting in Washington where the FDA was talking about the definition and testing methodology. And there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of dissension amongst both sides of the aisle trying to figure out talc and the dangers. We can say here, we understand quite clearly asbestos and asbestos containing talc, and I know talc individually can also be a problem. You went through the list of products very well. I want to end with some simple questions. And I think as a mom and a physician, this is really important. So there are substitutes for talc. So as a mom and a woman, and not that this is gender specific, but what do you want to tell consumers and then workers? How can they better prevent exposure to themselves and their families?
So I think one of the most important things is any consumer to be a smart consumer, whether you're in the grocery store or whether you're in the I don't mean to give a brand name of a store, but it comes to mind, Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever home improvement store is, read the label. Read what the ingredients are, because they're required by law to give what the ingredients are, or find out what the ingredients are. There are a variety of alternatives to talc. We know that cornstarch is a readily available and readily sold alternative for cosmetic talc. Kaolin clay, for example, it can be used in ceramics rather than the talc that's being added. Certain parts of Texas, and also where it might come from. So for example, Texas talc doesn't have the same constituents that Northeastern or New York State talc had. That might be a little more difficult to find out on the label. But there are other alternatives to talc, whether it's zinc oxide as a filler, whether it's silica as a filler, although breathing in silica is definitely not a good idea either. But if there's in food products, tapioca starch, arrowroot, these are all substitutes, rice powder. These are all things that can be substituted in, but the important thing is to read the label, to understand what is in the product, and if ideally you can find out where it's sourced.
And that's excellent. So we can not only vote with our dollars, but vote at a ballot box, but we can also use our votes within Washington. And what I think I love, one of the strong strengths, Dr. Moline, that you have is you're so reminiscent to me. I never got to meet Dr. Selikoff, but he was not only a physician, but he was a public health advocate. And you have the same tenets of Dr. Selikoff to me, and you're a remarkable physician. And it's a joy and an honor to be able to work with you.
Thank you, Linda. I truly appreciate it.
No, and it's meant sincerely. So last question, you're going to be on the hot seat for a second. So do you have a message for Congress?
Well, I think it's time that they ban asbestos. I think that we need to remove it certainly from industries that are bringing it into the country. I think all forms of asbestos are deadly. We should not be saying that this one particular miracle asbestos, since there is no such thing as a miracle asbestos, they're all deadly, is safe and we can use that in our products. We need to think about legacy. You know, for those of you who may be in the Philadelphia region, there has been a lot in the news about legacy asbestos in the schools in Philadelphia. I've been involved with the schools in New York in the 90s when it was called Operation Clean House, getting the asbestos out of the school, or at least identifying it, so that we knew when a construction project was happening, there could be appropriate steps to abate and protect all the students and the staff from asbestos that was in place. So we need to certainly ban any new uses of asbestos. We need to think about the asbestos that's in place, and we need to think about the other sources of asbestos exposure that may be in consumer products that we aren't thinking about, and use safer alternatives.
Thank you. And I know you'll be articulating all of those points during our May 28th press conference, where the EPA missed a lot of those nuggets. Okay, so now we're going to say thank you to Dr. Moline for a second, and Bob Sussman is on the bottom part of my screen, and the participants today have the great pleasure and honor of meeting a distinguished environmental lawyer, and I also, like Jackie, I call Bob my friend. He takes calls at all hours of the day and night. He is not only one of the smartest environmental lawyers I've ever worked with, but he is so dedicated to banning asbestos, the work that ADAO does, and really public health. So Bob, tell us a little bit. I hope your buttons aren't busting off your shirt, Bob. You're not too embarrassed by my singing your praises? No? He says no, not yet. So tell us a little bit about yourself, but also you served in Clinton's administration as the EPA Deputy Administrator during 93 and 94, which is just a couple years after the EPA unbanned asbestos. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I am, as you mentioned, Linda, I am a lawyer by training, spent most of my career in private practice. Focused very early on environmental and product safety law, and have loved doing this work, which is very important, I think, to all of us. Certainly, very important to the public. I have served at US EPA in two different administrations. As you mentioned, in the Clinton years, I was fortunate enough to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate as the EPA Deputy Administrator. So during my time at EPA, I was the #2 person at EPA, had responsibility for pretty much everything that was going on across the agency, which is both a blessing and a curse. A curse because it was hard to really study any particular issue, but I was exposed to an enormous number of important environmental problems that EPA faces, and had the opportunity to work on those issues during a very important time for the agency. In 2009, I went back to EPA. First, I went to EPA as the co-chair of the Obama transition team. Our job was to see what the Bush administration had been up to try to identify some of the problems and the issues and the challenges, and to begin to develop an agenda for managing and moving the agency forward under President Obama. Shortly after that, the administrator of EPA, the new incoming administrator, Lisa Jackson, asked me to go down to the agency to be her senior policy counsel. And so I worked very closely with her for 4.5 years. My job was to advise her and help her oversee the biggest policy issues in the agency. So I was exposed to an enormous number of issues across the agency, had the privilege to work on some of the most important issues that we were facing, and to make a contribution to what I think was a very successful period in EPA's history. I will say that I became involved in the truly shattering and sobering asbestos issues at Libby, Montana during that period. And that was, to me, quite an education on asbestos, and opened my eyes to the asbestos issue in a way that they hadn't been open before. Since leaving EPA, most of my time is spent working with clients in the nonprofit sector with a focus on the Toxic Substances Control Act. And so that brought me into contact with Linda and ADAO. And about 1.5 years ago, I began helping Linda on a whole range of issues, some involving Congress, others involving EPA. And as Linda mentioned, the more I understand the true dimension of the asbestos issue and the impact that it has had and is continuing to have on public health, I think the challenge of removing asbestos from American society is truly a cause that everybody needs to get behind.
Thank you, Bob. And you are a remarkable, brilliant environmental lawyer. So during the last 16 years, Doug and I first started having congressional staff briefings because staffers come in, as you guys know, the House is always in flux every 2 years and the Senate every 6 years. So Doug and I lost my dear friend and partner from ALS about 2.5 years ago, but Doug and I recognized that there was a disconnect on the staff level about asbestos. They couldn't be as educated as Dr. Moline or Bob Sussman or even the toolbox that ADAO has. So we started doing staff briefings. And I bring that up for a reason because, Bob, you got to work with and see Mike Mattmuller a few times, I think maybe 2 or 3. But ADAO tries very hard to bring the real stories to members of Congress and their staff that shows it's not just numbers, it is people. And we sometimes, in a general sense, I think the agencies lose sight of the people part. So Bob, thank you for allowing us to have both a legislative and a legal strategy to do our work to prevent all asbestos-caused diseases. So let's dive into it. This is something Bob and I talk probably 45 minutes every morning. I'm thankful that your wife is so giving of your time because we spend a lot of time to the participants on this call. Bob is remarkable. He basically works pro bono for ADAO. Don't get any ideas anybody else. He's overcommitted. But what he gives to ADAO is something that is invaluable to me. So let's talk about the EPA draft risk evaluation for asbestos. So that is a very horrific document that we've been reviewing, 300 pages, but it actually doesn't even, for this conversation, it doesn't even include talc. While you probably see a red scar on my head for bang here when we go to EPA to have meetings, we've told the EPA that talc, asbestos-containing talc, can be found in crayons and in kids' toys that we tested. So let's talk from your knowledge as within the administration and what you do now with ADAO. Tell me about the draft risk evaluation and the fact it doesn't include talc. What does that mean to you and to us?
Yeah, well, let me take a step back. As Linda mentioned, in 1989, EPA actually banned almost all uses of asbestos. They did that under the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is our country's principal chemical management law. Unfortunately, the ban on asbestos was overturned in a suit filed by the industry against EPA in 1991. And after that court decision, there has been virtually no regulation of the commercial use of asbestos in the United States, which puts us in a very different place from the many countries over 60 who have, in fact, banned asbestos. In 2016, Congress amended the Toxic Substances Control Act. One of the reasons they did that was because EPA had been unable to ban asbestos. And everybody recognized that the statute that couldn't ban asbestos wasn't going to be much use on any other chemical. And so the goal of Congress was to put in place a risk evaluation and chemical management scheme with some teeth to it, some muscle behind it, with the goal of taking a hard look at unsafe chemicals like asbestos, but also including many others who, like asbestos, had not been banned and regulated the way they should have. The first step in carrying out the new law, the EPA to pick 10 chemicals on which to conduct risk evaluations. They picked asbestos in 2016. And so over the last 3.5 years, EPA has been working on a risk evaluation of asbestos. Now, just to pause here, there has not been a comprehensive risk evaluation of asbestos since the 1980s. And so for EPA to now conduct an asbestos risk evaluation is a big deal. It's a big step. It's an important step. The evaluation can be a very positive development that helps us understand better the risk of asbestos, or it can be an unfortunate development because it does not address the entirety of the risk and does not take advantage of the best available science. So we have a lot of concerns with the way EPA is doing this risk evaluation. You'll hear about these on May 28th, but I do want to zero in on talc and talc-based products. As Linda said, talc-based cosmetics, they're regulated by FDA. They're not regulated by EPA. However, there are other consumer products containing talc. Crayons would be one example that are subject to the Toxic Substances Control Act and are regulated by EPA. And then, as Dr. Moline described, there is a broad range of industrial uses of talc, and those are also regulated by EPA. Unfortunately, when you read through the 300-page plus draft risk evaluation that EPA has developed, you won't find any reference to talc. You won't find any reference to consumer products containing talc, and you won't find any discussion at all of exposure to asbestos as a result of the industrial uses of talc. So we think that this is a gaping hole in the risk evaluation. As Linda mentioned, it's a hole that could have been avoided because we told EPA on numerous occasions that they need to be addressing talc and asbestos contamination of talc, but they didn't listen. And I think now they need to hear from scientists and others that talc needs to be addressed, that this hole in the risk evaluation needs to be filled.
Absolutely, it's a sham. So, and ADAO doesn't lobby. We don't have government affairs people that live in DC. We do it the old-fashioned way. We roll up our sleeves, we make our own meetings, and we knock on doors to educate members of Congress. So it's been a heavy lift, and we had to fight for over 6 months to set up for asbestos to just even be prioritized. I mean, it was almost 4 years ago that President Obama signed it into law, the Lautenberg Chemical Safety Act, and he actually used asbestos as the reason, the impetus for passing the Lautenberg bill and then signing it into law because EPA couldn't ban asbestos. So knowing that, Bob, you've worked diligently on the other 8 chemicals before for risk review, and of course asbestos is the 9th chemical for risk review. You've seen this process. So I want to talk a little bit from talc and shift to the fiber types that the EPA is going to theoretically review in the draft risk evaluation. It's only one fiber type, and there's 5 other known chemical fiber types that we commonly refer to. So let's talk why on earth, or how can it be that EPA is only going to address the risk for chrysotile, and how is that wrong, or how will it impact public health or their risk review?
Well, historically, risk assessments on asbestos have covered all of these 6 recognized asbestos fiber types, and they've used available data that reflects exposure to the full range of asbestos fibers, and they've developed risk estimates which apply across the board to all the different fibers. What EPA has done here is really quite unorthodox and a significant departure from historical thinking on asbestos risk evaluations. It's zeroed in on one fiber type, that's chrysotile, and it's based the entire risk evaluation only on data relating to exposure to chrysotile. Now, there are a lot of scientific concerns about that approach, but from a real world standpoint, it makes no sense at all. And the reason it makes no sense at all is because we know that exposure in the real world is not just to chrysotile, it is to all of the common fiber types. Asbestos contaminated talc is a very good example because the asbestos that is in talc is not just chrysotile. There is some chrysotile, but there are amphibols and other fibers that are present. So the way EPA has structured this risk evaluation, even if they did include asbestos contaminated talc, they would be addressing it with one hand tied behind their back because they're only looking at chrysotile and not all the fibers. There's another problem here that I think ties back to things that Dr. Moline was discussing, and that is that EPA is only looking at two diseases related to asbestos: lung cancer and mesothelioma. In fact, as Dr. Moline indicated, the literature indicates a relationship between asbestos exposure and laryngeal cancer and also ovarian cancer. It also indicates an important relationship between asbestos and non-cancer diseases, pleural diseases and asbestosis. EPA is not addressing any of those health endpoints and concerns. And again, to come back to talc, one reason why that is a problem is that there has been extensive exposure by women over the years to talc. Indeed, for some of them, as Dr. Moline indicated, it may be the principal source of exposure to asbestos that they have experienced. But EPA is saying that we're not going to look at ovarian cancer, which is a disease that could well be significantly correlated to exposure to talc by females. So we have three problems here. They're not looking at talc, number one. Number two, they're not looking at all fiber types. Number three, they're not looking at all cancers and non-cancer diseases.
Yeah, it's shattering for me personally because we've worked so hard to get the Lautenberg bill passed and then to address the flaws that the EPA faced, the difficulties they faced banning it and keeping a ban, but we're not giving up. So let's, before we dive into questions, we have some here, I want to just spend a couple of minutes, Bob, talking about the bill. So in 2015, Senator Boxer introduced the Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act. And we knew it didn't really have legs. It was introduced very late in the year of 2015. But it was introduced, it was called so-called a marker bill. Well, subsequent to that, we've had Senator Merkley and Representative Bonamici embrace the bill and reintroduce it in 2016. But the best news for ADAO and for people on this call is thanks to Bob, we've been able to take a bill that was written just to really stop imports and use and expand. And Bob, I do want you to talk about the impurity clause because although there's a jurisdictional difference between the FDA and the EPA with cosmetics, there are three bills presently in the House that deal with cosmetic contaminated cosmetics, and some deal with just asbestos alone. So we have 3 FDA-driven bills, and we have 1 EPA bill that you are the principal author of, and you've just done remarkable things. So touching on RBAN very briefly with the 4 components of, you know, all fibers plus the liviamphable, the legacy study, obviously the right to know, chemical companies would have to report. The legacy study is obviously huge. And then a ban of all imports and use, which this bill is so remarkable to those participants who may not have read it. It actually passed out of the Energy and Commerce Big Committee by 47-1 and has nearly 100 members of Congress that support it. And we've done that with no government affairs people in Washington. We've done it just with ourselves. So Bob, for this call, this is going to be one of our wrap-up questions so we can get to some of the Q&A. But talk about the impurity language that you helped write for RBAN, which is the acronym for the Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act. Talk about how that impurity clause could help the EPA to restrict and obviously prohibit talc-based products in the United States.
Yeah. Just to take a step back, in a legal sense, the asbestos which is present in talc is, in commercial talc, is an impurity. You could also call it a contaminant. It's not an intended component of talc from the standpoint of talc's commercial and industrial uses. However, we knew when we engaged with the Congress that asbestos had been found not only in FDA-regulated cosmetics, but in TSCA-regulated consumer products like crayons. And so we wanted to make sure that our bill did not inadvertently exclude the presence of asbestos as a contaminant or impurity in various workplaces or industrial products or consumer products. So we were able to write the legislation so it applied to mixtures and articles containing asbestos as an impurity. And I think that's a very positive step. Otherwise, it would be very, very difficult for EPA to regulate asbestos product contamination. Now, as the bill went through the process and based on the markup that we had last March, the impurity provisions were refined, and the refinement was that impurities would be subject to the ban on asbestos when they are present in a mixture or an article at levels of 0.1% or above. And in the case of construction, minerals used for construction purposes at levels of 0.25% or above. So these are not ideal provisions, but when you look at the importance of including impurities in the bill, and you look at what the bill does cover, this is definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah, landmark for Mike, Matt Mueller, Dr. Selikoff, everyone else that came well before us and may not be here. It's time to get this bill passed and stop imports and use with the other things. Let's open up to Q&A. So before people drop off, I do want to say we'll send a closure thank you email and link to some things that Dr. Moline and Bob may have mentioned during this call, so you guys can reflect on that. The first question goes, it was asked by a really special woman in my world. Her name is Mavis Nye. She leads one of the largest and most productive mesothelioma warrior groups in the UK, and she does phenomenal work, and I dearly love her. I don't know if this is too legal, Jackie, but you do serve as an expert witness, but please accept or decline the question. Mavis is asking, how can you prove your mesothelioma was caused by talc as it was a long time ago? Those are those tricky lawyer questions.
So the first thing you do is you have someone take a real history to find out when you were exposed. And the fact that it was to cosmetic talc many years ago is no different from the fact that you might have worked with boilers when you were a high school during the summer in high school, and you develop a mesothelioma 50 years ago. You had that asbestos exposure 50 years earlier, and everyone will say your mesothelioma came as a result of that boiler exposure, because we know that the cements and the insulating products in boilers contained asbestos back then. Well, you used cosmetic talcum products 50 years ago or 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and there is ample testing data that shows that asbestos has been found in cosmetic talcum products. And when there are no other sources, then it's very easy. Sometimes people are exposed to more than one thing. They can, maybe their hobby was they liked working on cars, so they would have had exposure to asbestos from brakes, but they also used a lot of cosmetic talc. So for me, all of those exposures would contribute to someone's overall cumulative exposure or their overall dose. And we would say, we know you had exposure to asbestos. You had exposure to asbestos from the cosmetic talc that was shown to be contaminated with asbestos or contain asbestos. So we can make that connection and feel confident about that connection.
No, thank you. I think that, I'm sure that helped to answer Mavis's question. So Bob, as environmental lawyer, what are you seeing, since the EPA did a legacy study in 1984-ish, and it's past time they do another.
Did not hear you.
You didn't hear me?
Barely. Try again.
Okay, sorry, Bob. Let's talk about the 1984-ish EPA legacy study that they did. They did an investigation and study on structures, primarily public buildings and schools. The question is, and Toby is online from Canada, if your child goes to an older school, what do you recommend with a HERA in place, Bob? I don't know what Canada has. How can a parent rest assured that their kid's school is safe, or the asbestos is being managed appropriately according to the law of a HERA?
Yeah, well, I think depending on where you live, you may not be able to get the reassurance that you're looking for. We do have a law in this country. It's called a HERA, and it is specifically aimed at mitigating exposure to asbestos in schools. It was passed back in 1986. The idea behind the law is schools would be inspected for the presence of asbestos. If asbestos was there, they would be evaluated very closely. If there was a risk of exposure, there would be repairs. In some cases, asbestos would be removed from the school. It's a well-intentioned law. It's very sound in concept, but unfortunately, it is not an EPA priority these days. EPA is responsible for overseeing implementation, but they don't put much effort into that. And we know from news stories and surveys that have been conducted that we continue to have a very serious asbestos problem in our schools. So we need to be doing more to understand the risk. We need to be doing more to educate parents and school boards. We need to be pushing EPA to make enforcement of this law a priority. And then, with all legacies, we need to update our understanding of where the asbestos is, who is at risk, and what that risk entails.
And let's hope that the ban bill that we're working on passes, because there's a very strong legacy component in that. So I'm looking at my clock. It's noon here. I want to sincerely thank Dr. Moline and Bob Sussman and the team of Nicole and Tracy for helping us put on this Zoom meeting. It's always tricky when you try to do technology from a home office, etc. Also, I'd like to thank ADAO leadership and, of course, our sponsors that make all of our work possible. So with that being said, we're gonna pop a thank you. And I do see, Toby, you've asked a question. I'll take that online. It talks about testing. And Toby's a very strong advocate. That was the school question. You can test and not find it if you want to cover your eyes. And I think that's sometimes what happens in communities, Bob and Jackie, as you know, with PLM and TEM. So I'll take that offline with Toby. So Jackie and Bob, any parting comments after this robust conversation about talc and asbestos and prevention and policy? Jackie?
So, I think it's really critical that we think about how we can support making sure that we have a safer environment and get rid of asbestos in the various forms, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the home, whether it's in consumer products, and we'll be advocates. Make sure you look at the labels, identify what's in it, buy safer alternatives. When you're given the choice between buying cornstarch laden powder or buying talcum powder, it's on the label, buy the cornstarch. So do those things to advocate for yourself. I think the other thing I want all of you to leave with is when you go to your doctor, you make sure you're comprehensive in what kinds of products you've used and what kind of exposures you might have had, and think about it not just with asbestos, but with anything else, because it will help your provider come up with answers that may really impact your health. And that's been one of our goals, which is to really identify external causes of diseases. And asbestos is one of the most well-known external causes of disease out there.
Yeah, the really important points. Bob, do you have a parting message for this group?
Yeah. I just want to underscore that this draft EPA risk evaluation is incredibly important to anybody who cares about asbestos in public health. EPA is holding a public meeting of its scientific advisors starting on June 8th to review the risk evaluation. EPA is allowing statements by members of the public. Members of the public can comment in writing on the risk evaluation. I think it's incredibly important for anybody who is concerned about the path that EPA is on here to tell the agency about those concerns and underscore the importance of doing a comprehensive and health protective and science-based assessment of asbestos risk.
Thank you, Bob. Both important. So in our thank you email, Dr. Moline and Bob, before I send it out, we will have links where people will understand how they can comment for the draft risk evaluation, but also how can they help us move the Alan Reinstein Ban Asbestos Now Act forward, because those two things need to take some motion. So with that being said, thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and we'll see you on May 28th at the press conference that we're having at 2 o'clock. Cheers.